Here we go. All right then. So, thanks for coming. As usual, when I speak to transhumanist or futurist audiences, I'm going to make the assumption that most of you are really already familiar with the basics of what I've been doing over the past 10 or 15 years and what SENS Foundation does. So I won't be giving any kind of standard talk about, about SENS and about why I think it's realistic that we will be able to bring aging under medical control in the next few decades. For those of you who would like updates, actually I've given quite a few talks recently, as in like over the past 6 months, where I have focused on recent developments, both stuff that we ourselves have been doing and also stuff that's gone on elsewhere. And I know that some of those talks are online, so if you haven't looked me up on YouTube lately, that's the place to do things. Today what I'm going to do instead is talk about something completely different. And there are going to be a couple of unusual things about this talk. First of all, I've taken the title of the conference rather literally, Writing the Future, and I'm going to talk about writing, actually, and also more tangentially about how to talk to journalists, how I talk to journalists and so on. The other extremely unusual thing about this talk is that I'm going to be discussing a topic about which I have not formed a strong opinion. I'm actually not going to be leading to a particular point of view and arguing for it. I'm really going more to be developing a number of different, shall I actually speak into this? Yes, all right. A number of different lines of thought and discussion points, really, and I'm definitely going to be very interested in what other people have to say. I'm going to be talking about writing the future, and in particular about writing about the future. These are some reasons why people might want to do that. I'm going to be talking about the bottom one, which is why I do it. In other words, I want to influence the future. I want to make certain things happen sooner. And that's, I think, a pretty good definition of writing the future. So, what should we write if we want to write the future? This is the fundamental thing I want to discuss today. Should we basically just write what we think, what we believe to be true? Or should we modulate what we believe, the presentation of what we believe, according to the audience? And to the extent that we do that, should we do it to pacify the audience and generally make them like us and therefore do what we say? Or should we do the opposite? Should we actually make them uncomfortable and make them think on the basis that even if only a few of them think, they may actually do something as a result? I'm not sure about the answer to that, and I'm going to I'm going to discuss a few arguments one way or the other across those various alternatives. Today I'm not going to be talking about the issue of whether defeating aging is desirable, because I'm fairly sure that there's a reasonable consensus in this room on that point. I'm going to be talking about feasibility, but mainly I'm going to, as I've said, I'm going to be talking about feasibility. And I'm going to be talking especially about the issue of how much of a control over aging, how much postponement of age-related ill health we might expect to achieve, and how soon, and for whom. In other words, whether it's only for the wealthy, all those things. But I'm not going to be just looking at one data point there. I want to discuss both short-term predictions and also longer-term predictions, because they have somewhat distinct problems, issues in relation to outreach, in relation to writing and speaking to the media and so on. First of all, short-term. So I'm very sure that most of you know that I've been saying for at least the past decade, well, about that anyway, that the prospects are reasonably good for developing regenerative medicine solutions to the problems of aging, which we can define simply as restoring the function of the body, in other words, genuinely rejuvenating it, rather than simply slowing down the clock of aging, the decline that we experience. And that means, first of all, that I think we have a respectable chance within about the next 25 years of getting about 30 additional years of extra healthy life. I don't think that people are just going to drop dead at that point, as some other gerontologists are inclined to predict or even actually say would be desirable. I do, however, think that because this is going to be bona fide rejuvenation therapies that actually turn back the clock, that the people who will benefit from them will not simply be people who start these therapies and benefit from them throughout their lives, but rather people who only start to actually get these therapies in middle age or even later. So that's the definition. So then the question is, what can we say about this, and what should we say about this? First of all, people may say, well, how can one make such a prediction in the first place? Where's the data? How do I have any idea that allows me to give this estimate of a 50% chance of getting to a particular point within 25 years? And the first thing I want to completely concede is that this is massively subjective. It's an educated guess. But it is pretty damned educated. I know quite a lot about this. And therefore, I feel entitled to the opinion that my guess is likely to be more accurate than, or more likely to be more accurate than other people's guesses, which is better than nothing. I don't know how much more likely or how much more accurate, but if you want to believe someone, believe me. The other thing I want to emphasize is that many of the people who offer this criticism of such predictions are basic scientists, who are not really in the business of actually manipulating nature at all. They're only in the business of discovering how nature is, understanding nature. And as we're all familiar with, there is quite a disparity of mindset between those two communities. We're all very familiar, of course, with the fact that very top scientists, very top physicists were publishing proofs that powered flight was theoretically impossible right up until it was done. It's not exactly a failure of imagination, a failure of creativity. What it is a different way of using one's creativity. People actually, technologists and basic scientists really do use data in very different ways, and so they should, because they are doing different things. Technology design, pioneering technology, does involve leaps of faith that would not make sense in the design of experiments to discover how nature actually works, but it does make sense when developing new technological concepts. And here's another thing, and here's the first time that I'm really coming to the question of what we should say and what we shouldn't say. Brian Kennedy down here is very much a basic scientist and a good guy. He's a good guy. He's not dumb, and he's not like self-serving or anything like that. And he's the director of the Buck Institute for Aging Research, which is the biggest standalone dedicated facility in the world for the study of the biology of aging. Now, 10 years ago, or even as little as 5 years ago, it was still extremely unfashionable and politically incorrect for mainstream credentialed gerontologists to talk at all about postponing ill health, about medical control over aging. But somehow or other, possibly partly through my own efforts, this has changed over the last small number of years. And now it is actually very frequent to see people in positions like Brian Kennedy saying things like this, saying things about what we might be able to do in terms of postponement of age-related ill health. But read this statement really carefully. In fact, you probably won't even need to read it really carefully to see what I'm getting at. What he says here is, he thinks we could extend human healthy lifespan by 15%, which would translate into this. Now, look at the sort of thing that I say, right? I say, I think we've got a 50% chance of this specific amount of postponement of healthy life for this particular set of people in this particular time frame. What does Brian say? He doesn't say anything about how confident he is of this prediction. He doesn't say which humans, whether this has to start at birth or at adolescence, or whether it can start later. And in particular, he doesn't say anything about how soon he thinks we can develop these technologies. Now, that's a pretty serious set of shortcomings in this statement. But yet, no one criticizes him for saying it. Why not? What gives here? The answer is, this doesn't make people feel all that uncomfortable, whereas anything that has actual numbers in it tends to. But also, it's worse than that. One thing that people like Brian Kennedy, in fact, almost all politically correct gerontologists tend to avoid like the plague at this point, however much they may have embraced the idea of talking about intervention in general terms, is they try to keep the numbers small if they talk about them at all. You'll notice that Brian has here 15%, a decade. No one's going to get too frightened about a decade. No one gets too frightened about 30 years, the number I talk about when I talk about this robust human rejuvenation.
And the reason they don't is because it's just sort of, there's no actual concrete reason. It's just, it feels sufficiently warm and fuzzy. If you ignore all the important stuff, like the fact that it's for people who are already in middle age, or the fact that the actual approach using regenerative medicine is something that no one really thought about until I came along, and especially if you incorporate the general principle of accelerating change, which people are now sufficiently comfortable with that Ray Kurzweil can get his book to the top of the Amazon list. And if you furthermore incorporate this fact, the fact that I mentioned earlier that it's now fashionable to talk about life extension, then bingo, everything's fine. Just so long as the numbers aren't too scary. Yeah. And of course, my numbers are much scarier than I've said so far. Another thing that I guess almost everyone in this room is already familiar with is that for some time I've been discussing the concept of longevity escape velocity. The fact that regenerative medicine, rejuvenation technologies have a much greater potential to be improved fast enough to keep one step ahead of the problem than technologies that only slow aging down. If you take someone who's already 30 or 40 or 50 and you halve their rate of aging, let's say 50, and you halve their rate of aging, then by the time they're 70, they're going to be biologically 60. And by the time they're 90, they're going to be biologically 70. That means that you've gained a bit of time to figure out what to do next, to halve the rate of aging again and so on, but you're never going to make them biologically younger again that way, and it's going to be a progressively tougher job to keep up, even to stop them from getting to a point where the risk of death and serious disease is very high. Whereas, if you have even a rather mediocre, only vaguely comprehensive rejuvenation therapy that can take someone age 60 and take them back to, let's say, biologically 40, you've bought yourself at least 20 years of time in which to figure out what to do next and re-rejuvenate them, even if it's a little harder the second time. And that's what led me to the belief, which I have talked about for some time, that even though the time frame for adding 30 years to average or indeed record life expectancy is very speculative, I put it at 50% that we'll get there in 25 years, but at least 10% that we won't get there in 100 years. That's very speculative. Once we get there, it's vanishingly unlikely that we will hit other problems that still kill people very fast because of aging. In other words, that people living to pretty much arbitrary lifespans, let's say 1,000, will come along that were born only a little bit, maybe 10 or 20 years later than the first people who lived to, let's say, 150. This is the sort of thing that really gets under the skin of people who are politically correct. And of course the reason is the shock value. Now, there are a lot of reasons why the shock value, the sticker shock, shall we say, gets under people's skin. In some cases, it's because people really don't like the sound of living a long time. As well, we've heard all those arguments, I'm not going there today. However, in the gerontology community, an enormous part of the problem is that it gets lots of press attention, which has two negative consequences in the eyes of mainstream gerontologists. Number one, if people believe what we're saying here, what I'm saying, then it may distract attention from the supposedly much more important work that they are doing, and therefore, thereby distract funding from it as well. And secondly, it may be worse than that. It may bring the entire field of biogerontology into disrepute because everyone will say it's science fiction, and that will have a much bigger effect on funding. Unfortunately, it's hard to argue too strongly against those things, because the thing is, it does get a lot of press. I do spend my entire life in front of the camera. And a lot of the press is the wrong sort of press. The fact is, we get a lot of over-sensationalist media attention that focuses far too strongly on the longevity consequences of this sort of research and the societal consequences of those longevity consequences, and far too little on the health consequences, on the actual purpose of this work, which is, of course, to keep people from getting Alzheimer's disease and getting cancer and so on and so forth. Ultimately, we all have to remember all the time, and I have to bang away at journalists all the time and tell them that the longevity benefits are just a side effect. They are just a probable consequence of keeping people healthy. But here's the interesting part. And this is the part that I haven't discussed either in print or on camera before, as far as I'm aware. What points of view are out there with regard to the plausibility of this whole longevity escape velocity concept? Is it actually something that is going to happen? And if so, why? And if not, why do I think it is going to, and what are the arguments? And let's talk about a bit about what those arguments are, and also about what we should say about those arguments, in order, of course, to go back to the original goal of writing the future. Here are basically the 3 points of view that exist out there. There's my point of view, which is this. I basically say, well, the reason why I think it's almost certain that we will stay one step ahead of the problem once we have achieved that first few decades of postponement of ill health is that looking at the biology of looking at the things that go wrong in the body, and looking at the spectrum of difficulty of repairing them, it seems very, very clear to me that the additional incremental improvements that we're going to have to make to the comprehensiveness of the SENS panel of interventions is really going to be a set of incremental improvements, a set of things where, step by step, we create new minor variations on the therapy we already have developed that address another example of a particular category of problem, and another example, and so on. It seems, just from what we already know about the biology of the problem, that it's very unlikely that there will be a series of fundamental new problems to solve that take fundamentally different solutions from the solutions that have already come into existence. And that allows me to infer that it's going to be rapid, that the development of these improvements are going to be rapid, simply by looking at other technologies in which the same sort of storyline has occurred, in which we have had some fundamental breakthrough that was required and which couldn't really be predicted at all until it happened, but which subsequently enjoyed the benefits of a rapid and indeed pretty smooth sequence of incremental advances. So powered flight is, of course, another good example. That's my view. Now, another view is we just don't know enough biology yet to be able to say anything like that. The evidence that we have, whether from looking at what we know of our biology right now, or indeed from looking at the history of other technologies, is far too tangential to justify coming up with such a strong degree of confidence. And that is, a defensible point of view. I'm not going to try to ridicule that point of view at all. I think that it's very worthwhile to have, ongoing debate about which of these two alternatives holds more water. What I want to talk about is this one down here. I don't actually talk about longevity escape velocity as much as I used to. I'm going to go on and talk a bit and say a bit more about that in the next slide. But ultimately, the point of view that I want to discuss for the next few minutes is that a lot of people say, well, this whole longevity escape velocity thing is never going to happen. Well, yeah, we've got quite a good chance of getting these 30 years sometime soon, maybe not as soon as Aubrey says, but fairly soon. But we're never going to get, 4-digit lifespans. And you ask them why, and it comes down to this. I bet everyone can work out what this means. Argument from personal incredulity. You've all heard of it, right? So the question then is, what should we do? What should we talk about? Well, I actually don't talk about longevity escape velocity to most audiences nearly as much as I used to. And for many audiences, I don't talk about it at all. Now, that's not because I've changed my mind about it. This is the actual reason. I've got more science to talk about. SENS Foundation's been going quite a while now, and we've been funding actual research of our own for now 5 or 6 years. And, of course, there's other research going on independently of the Foundation that's relevant to SENS. The fact is, there's a lot more actual data, actual important scientific results that constitute major progress towards the implementation of SENS out there now. We are publishing stuff. We have a paper that came out a few months ago showing the first really hard evidence that we can rescue, we can combat the toxicity of the main compound that causes cardiovascular disease using a bacterial enzyme. This is something that we've been talking about for many, many years, and now we've actually done it. Only in cell culture so far, but it's a great start. And of course, I talk about it quite a lot when I give lectures and also when I give interviews. We've got a paper in review right now in Nature Biotechnology in another of our projects. We've got other papers coming up over the next few months. So that's great. And that's the reason why I don't talk so much about the long term anymore. But it transpires, and this was initially quite a shock to me, but actually it became pretty unsurprising when I thought about the motivations. It turns out that an awful lot of the mainstream people in our field, in the field of the biology of aging and related fields, have leapt to the assumption that because I don't talk about longevity escape velocity so much anymore, the reason actually is that I find it rather embarrassing, that I've actually decided that it was complete nonsense in the first place and that I don't want to go there. But that I'm too cowardly to say so. Now, why would they think that? Well, to be perfectly honest, and this is not terribly charitable, but I'm fairly sure it's true, I think that basically people are thinking that because that's what they want to think. In other words, they still are in the argument from personal incredulity. They don't want to think that longevity escape velocity makes any sense. So they're grasping at this straw that tells them that they have some justification, namely that the person who's been talking about it so much is not talking about it so much anymore. That's a bit of a shame, really. I think it's rather undesirable that people would think that. Now, you may say, well, does it really matter what people think about longevity escape velocity? Surely what actually matters is that we hasten the development of robust human rejuvenation, first things first. And the way we'll do that is by getting people to talk and think about that and be more aware of its feasibility and indeed its desirability. But that's not obvious either, because ultimately the only obstacle right now to full steam ahead on implementing robust human rejuvenation, implementing SENS reasonably well in the short term, the only obstacle is funding. We have the plan in detail. It's standing the test of time really well. It hasn't changed at all for a decade, really, not in any major way. We've also got the people. We've got the enthusiasm on the part of all the people that we need to get this done. The only thing we don't have is enough money. So where's that money going to come from? Well, we know that it's a very tricky business getting it out of the government while the public remains so ambivalent. We know that it's a very tricky business getting it out of the private sector while a lot of the proponents of SENS are still quite a long way away and not really commercializable. So we're still looking mainly at philanthropy, at wealthy individuals and less wealthy ones. And then we've got to think, well, where are those wealthy individuals starting out? You've got people who actually want to live forever. And the thing is, those are the people where the money's been coming from so far, predominantly. So, an argument can be made that that's where we should carry on looking. And they will be thinking, well, yeah, thanks very much, I'll probably only be about a minute. And that's, that's all very well, but the thing is, they of course want to think about longevity escape velocity, so maybe we should talk about it. Then there's people who are petrified of the idea of defeating aging, so maybe we shouldn't talk about it. But then there are the neutrals. There's an awful lot of wealthy neutrals out there who basically sort of like the idea and they sort of get the logic of all of this, but their wives are anti-immortalists or whatever. There's a lot of people like that around. So it's unclear what we should say and how much we should say it. Here's some more complications. We don't really need to talk about longevity escape velocity to immortalists. They understand it already. It's really trivial to understand if you want to. Then there's the issue of, we should talk about it because that's where the real benefit comes in terms of the humanitarian side. If we really achieve and maintain longevity escape velocity, we just don't have any age-related frailty anymore. Whereas if we only get robust human rejuvenation, we've still got more or less as much of it as we have today. Also, there's this problem. I actually think it's true that we're going to have longevity escape velocity. It's really hard not telling the truth. But here's the main thing. I can't get out of it now, and nor can anyone else who's ever talked about this sort of thing. It's however little I talk about it in lectures or in interviews, it's always coming up. So it's a huge dilemma. This is my last slide. It's a huge dilemma. And I really would like input from all of you. I'm here all day. I may not be here tomorrow, but I'm here all day. I would love to know what people think about this. Thanks very much.